6 billion people, innumerable cultures, countless ideas. In this world of unrest, yearning and horror, there's a constant zeal to form a better planet. As the words of the spin doctors leave a numbness within those searching for the truth, come with us and observe Globespin.
Welcome to Globespin. This week we walk a tough beat with social workers in Nairobi as they try to steer an ever-increasing number of children away from a life on the streets. While the Millennium celebrations have come and gone, it's time to take a look at the magnificent legacy that's remained. One modern, the other medieval, spanning 1,000 turbulent years of history in between. The place is London's Millennium Dome. The space is filled with flying pies as kids battle their way into the Guinness Book of Records.
1 minute, you're a third of the way there.
The people of London recently voted in their first ever directly elected mayor, and he may soon need a forklift for his in-tray. It's out with the old pomp and ceremony and in with a new style of self-determined government. This week we meet the peacekeepers of Abkhazia in northwestern Georgia. In what was once a popular resort area for holidaymakers, they're now tasked with finding homes for 200,000 displaced and war-weary locals. We reveal the sorry state of child labour in Pakistan and the efforts being made to save up to 1 million young carpet weavers from their seemingly inevitable fate. Oriental carpets from Muslim cultures all over Asia and Europe sold for a sultan's ransom at Christie's this week. Those stories and much more on this week's edition of Globespin. Kenyan social worker Rhoda Kiora is making her daily rounds. She's lived in the capital Nairobi for most of her life and knows all the back alleys where hundreds of street children live. In Africa, as in Asia and Latin America, thousands of abandoned children are ending up on the streets. Homeless, they survive on their wits or through violence. The police harass them, the locals fear them. To eat, they resort to theft, begging or prostitution, and many sniff glue in a futile attempt to escape the reality of their appalling situation. Rhoda is one of the few adults who doesn't try to avoid them. And the results of her good work are seen clearly at this rescue centre set up by the international labour organisation, the ILO. Yesterday's street children are enjoying a normal life again. Sadly, some arrived with the AIDS virus, while others will return to the streets. But for most, this is the start of something new. The aim is to eventually reunite them with their families. In its efforts to eradicate child exploitation, ILO targets yet another major problem: domestic servitude. The children that are most vulnerable, the most exploited and downtrodden, are domestic servants. Most are young girls, isolated behind closed doors and treated little better than slaves. These girls are the lucky ones. Their employers have let them come to the ILO Centre in Nairobi. Here they enter a whole new world. They can discuss their problems, get an education and learn new skills in order to get better jobs in the future. There are 150,000 street children and young domestic servants in Africa, 60,000 in Nairobi alone. And now for each of them, a new window of hope and opportunity has finally been opened. Sitting proudly atop the Greenwich Meridian line is London's magnificent new Millennium Dome, a landmark now synonymous with the birth of a new era. On New Year's Eve 2000, the Dome hosted a spectacular show for 10,000 invited guests, among them the Queen and the Prime Minister. A blend of music, acrobatics and dance told the story of one family through 3 generations, reflecting the past, the present and the future. Hundreds of miles north of the Dome, the ancient city of Durham is dominated by another Millennium building, the last Millennium, that is. It's been 1,000 years since Durham Cathedral was founded by monks seeking a permanent resting place for the body of St. Cuthbert. This magnificent edifice also helped to establish Durham as a centre for learning and pilgrimage. Now the people of this medieval city are building a shrine to their forefathers and to mark the arrival of the new millennium. Where a busy road now cuts the city in two, a new civic centre is being built to reunite it and strengthen Durham's role as an important regional and cultural location. 20 years of design and planning have already led to several award-winning schemes. Durham's role in British history is also celebrated in another Millennium project, an amazing embroidery that chronicles the nation's turbulent story over the last 1,000 years. There's King John's signing of the Magna Carta, England's famous bard, William Shakespeare. All the significant figures, events and objects that have shaped the nation are preserved in 5 panels of embroidery, more than 2 metres high and many metres long. The Millennium Embroidery, as it's called, is the result of 4 years of painstaking research and labour by renowned artisan Linda Straw. Linda spent up to 18 hours a day at her machine, stitching together individual thumbnail sketches of history made by a team of 200 embroiderers nationwide from her hand-drawn designs. It was a daunting task, beginning with a medieval panel which she completed herself. The finished work is a people's embroidery, 300 interconnecting images depicting not just royalty and politicians, but a rich social history reflecting every aspect of British life. Eventually, the embroidery will be exhibited at the Millennium Dome, a permanent record of British history with all its moments of tragedy, glory and humour. But for now, it's on tour around the country, raising money for charity. It's bound for Scotland as well, a country with an unrivalled reputation for celebrating New Year, or Hogmanay. In Edinburgh, the city's historical castle provided the backdrop for 7 days of street celebrations, an extravaganza of pipers, theatre, fireworks and fun. But when the bells of London heralded in the new millennium, 1,000 years after the Chinese invented gunpowder, the citizens of Durham must have spared a thought for their own little slice of history, their majestic cathedral. After many exhaustive months of campaigning by a field of 11 hopeful contenders, independent candidate Ken Livingstone has become the first ever directly elected Mayor of London. The daunting task they all tried their hardest to achieve was to run this thriving capital city of 7 million people. The direct election has given Londoners back the right to govern their own affairs and decide about their own priorities. The sight of the Lord Mayor of London, regally adorned and riding in his gilded coach, is a thing of the past. The new position mightn't come with a pretty horse and buggy, but it does have political clout. London finally joins the other capital cities of Europe in getting its own mayor and 25-member assembly. Mayor Livingstone will oversee a budget of over £3.1 billion, or $5 billion for running the nation's capital. His mandate includes transport, the environment and emergency services, amongst other things, but with only limited tax-raising powers. Traffic congestion in the streets of central London is becoming a major problem, while many believe the public transport system is falling apart. 2 items that will need some priority attention from the new mayor. How to raise the money for this was one of the major issues of the campaign. 4 out of 5 of those who commute into London for work do so by public transport. London Underground estimates that £7 billion will be needed over the next decade to repair and modernise the network. Mayor Livingstone believes that the government's proposal to partially privatise the tube is a recipe for chaos and plans to fight for a government grant instead. Above ground, the mayor will be trying to raise traffic speeds in the capital to beyond snail pace. The present 10-mile-an-hour crawl could be improved upon by encouraging more commuters out of their cars and onto London's famous red buses. budget for the police department now also comes under the control of the mayoral office. A survey last year found that crime was the top concern of Londoners. Almost a quarter of all crime in the UK stems from here. The mayor has therefore pledged to return the 2,000 police officers lost through budget cuts in recent years. London has some of the wealthiest and some of the poorest people in the country. You wouldn't have to look too hard to find many of Britain's most expensive mansions, nor some of its most dilapidated hovels. While house prices in London have risen by half in the last 3 years, way ahead of the rest of the country, there are nearly 40,000 families living in temporary accommodation. This serious social problem is yet another that will weigh on the shoulders of the new mayor and his assembly. Add to the list town planning, cultural issues, waste management, arts, sport, tourism and retail development, and it's no wonder the experts are saying that the powers of even the most enigmatic and ambitious local leader will be sorely tested. Only time will tell if the former Greater London Council leader will survive his new appointment. After all, some of his earlier policies made him a tabloid hate figure. The Sun newspaper once described the new mayor as the most odious man in Britain. London's economy dwarfs that of any other city in the United Kingdom. A fifth of the earnings of the country is made in London, which has an annual gross domestic product estimated at over £100 billion. The business community here is eager to see the elected mayor and assembly in action. They need someone to advocate the city's case both in Europe and overseas. The mayor, who's become very powerful by virtue of his 7 million strong electorate, could be just the person they need. Unlike many of his counterparts in Europe and the United States, London's mayor has very limited tax-raising powers to fund his long list of responsibilities. Many expect that Londoners will inevitably face paying local taxes sooner rather than later. As for the elections themselves, not only were they the first to herald in a directly elected mayor for London, but the very process marked another interesting milestone. A new electronic vote counting system was tested for the first time. It promised 100% accuracy and a greatly sped up election result. Once it would have taken 5 days to count up the 5 million votes received, but it took just a single day with the new computer system. A morning briefing at UNIMIG, the United Nations Observer Mission in Georgia. This is UNIMIG's regional headquarters at Gali, inside separatist Abkhazia in northwestern Georgia. The breakup of the Soviet Union brought conflict to this region. Abkhaz irregulars ousted Georgian troops after a year-long conflict that killed over 10,000 soldiers. In 1994, the Georgian government and the Abkhaz side agreed to stop fighting. One of UNIMIG's responsibilities is to monitor that ceasefire. In Gali, the mission uses mine protection vehicles to patrol this still unstable region. A Bangladeshi soldier is learning how to use a metal detector. This is an exercise, but the threat of mines is real. Recently, another peacekeeper from Bangladesh was killed by a landmine. His replacement is well aware of the tragic legacy they can leave behind. The observers stop at a local power station which supplies electricity to both Georgia and Abkhazia. In a positive development, both sides have agreed to keep the power station open. The engineer assures them that everything's quiet here. Peacekeepers visit a village destroyed during the war. Almost 200,000 people are still displaced by the conflict. The political status of Abkhazia and the plight of the displaced are key issues for the return of peace to this region known for the longevity of its people. From the oldest to the youngest, the views of the people are virtually the same. When the team pays a visit to the local school, they hear stories of the atrocities witnessed by the youngsters. These children are mainly Mingrelians, ethnic Georgians who were only toddlers when the war broke out. Sadly, this little boy can't recall the days when his town was a popular resort for holidaymakers. But he does remember the day he saw his grandmother killed by Abkhaz soldiers. And when asked if he could forgive the Abkhaz for what they did, his reply is brief and to the point: no. From mission headquarters, a second team leaves to patrol the Kuduri Valley, where the Svans and ethnic Georgian groups often engage the Abkhaz militia. While there hasn't been any serious conflict recently, the situation is far from peaceful. The two sides only communicate via the peacekeepers. Due to constant landslides, the vehicles can only go so far. The peacekeepers have to travel on bicycles. The bikes trail through the spectacular valleys of the Caucasus Mountains, and although it might look a bit unusual, the work they perform this way is invaluable. Back at Gali, the UNOMIG medical team is having a busy day. A civilian arrives with a serious heart condition. The doctor examines him and is able to give him medicine that would otherwise be impossible to get in these parts. UNOMIG doctors also help the 1,500 Commonwealth of Independent States troops stationed nearby. The day's work is finally over for the peacekeepers. They can now relax and exchange stories. The international observers come from 23 different countries. Although theirs is a difficult and sometimes perilous mission, they believe the peace and reconciliation they offer is well worth the risk. In shops throughout the Western world, hand-knotted carpets fetch thousands of dollars. The multi-million-dollar industry thrives on an ancient craft that is still practiced in countries like Pakistan, India and Nepal. But often hidden behind the threads of a carpet's intricate design is the work of small children. They come from poor Pakistani families and are paid a quarter of an adult weaver's wage. Between 500,000 to 1 million youngsters work up to 14 hours a day in appalling conditions. The carpet designs use ancient patterns written in a code that is recited by the older apprentices. Ironically, there are so many child labourers here that even if they were free to attend schools, the country's education system would only be able to accommodate a third of them at most. The national economy would also be at serious risk of collapse. Nevertheless, Pakistan has recently passed laws greatly limiting child labour, although for the most part the laws are ignored. With that in mind, Western markets have begun to cater to new customers who are sensitive to the conditions under which the products are made. Media pressure and consumer campaigns provide strong incentives for the manufacturers to produce carpets without the use of child labour. The Geneva-based International Labour Organization, the ILO, recently signed an agreement with Pakistani carpet manufacturers to eliminate child labour from the industry. To rescue the 4 to 14-year-olds who make up a staggering 90% of the Pakistani carpet industry, the ILO and manufacturers have set up training and monitoring programs in 30 villages. Alternatives to work in the form of education, vocational training and social services are provided to 8,000 former child weavers. But untying the economic and cultural knots that bind these children to carpet making will take an effort on the part of parents, employers, governments and consumers the world over. Under the international campaign to combat child labour, it's hoped that in the future children will no longer need to sing for their suppers, but simply for the joy of being youngsters at play. It's one of the world's most famous steam locomotives, and now Stephenson's rocket is returning to London. Arriving at the Science Museum, it was carefully unpacked. It's not the first steam locomotive, but it was the first steam locomotive to demonstrate what steam power could do on the railways. The rocket is to form the centrepiece of a new gallery dedicated to 250 years of technology and engineering history. Stephenson's rocket has been away from London for nearly 3 years, during which time it travelled to museums and exhibitions all over the world, including 3 in Japan. But the museum says it's lucky even to have rocket, after it was effectively left for scrap. Alongside the Apollo 10 capsule that went around the moon in preparation for the first moon landing and other engineering achievements, curators are expecting the Science Museum's new gallery to be a huge success and drawing thousands of overseas visitors every year. The Millennium Dome in Greenwich, England is the home of the extraordinary, but today is something special. It's like getting kitted up for a nuclear reactor, but instead of deadly plutonium, the fallout is bound to be yellow and messy. custard pies, ready for the world's biggest custard pie fight, organised by a children's website, funplanet.co.uk.
5,
The countdown begins.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Then, let's go! Let's go indeed. In 3 minutes, the contestants will need to fling more than 3,000 pies to beat the old record set 2 years ago. As the minutes tick by, so the 150-gallon custard tanks run dry. It's mayhem out there under the dome, even for giant mice.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The event is a serious attempt to get into the Guinness Book of Records, and they've made it at 3,312 pies. Setting world records can be a messy business. The great custard pie battle is over. Now, all that remains is to clear up after one of the wildest world records ever. The sale of a collection of sumptuous Oriental carpets is the highlight of a week focusing on Islamic works of art at Christie's auction house in London. The carpets come from across the present or former Muslim world, from Mughal India to Moorish Spain. Despite the vagueness of the term Oriental, when applied to carpets, it does denote identifiable characteristics, essentially abstract and non-figurative designs. Transylvania, in the 17th century when this carpet was made, though a largely Christian area, formed part of the Ottoman Empire. Carpets there were more than mere works of art. One of the gems of this sale is this Persian rug made with silk and metal thread dating from the late 19th century. Reputedly made for the Shah Muzaffar al-Din, it has verses by the classical poet Hafiz running around the border. This 17th century carpet from India shows the influence of Persian design in the art of Mughal India. Carpets like it can be seen in the many miniature paintings depicting the court of Akbar, Jahangir and other Mughal emperors of India. And it's not only carpets from the Islamic world that are in demand. This wooden panel from the minbar pulpit of the 13th century mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo sold for a staggering $850,000. If you thought road rage was as bad as it gets, what about pedestrian rage? An unusual condition that usually strikes around Christmas time each year. But is this really the solution? One considerate but slightly eccentric group has devised an imaginative scheme to prevent pedestrian rage on the streets of London. These radical thinkers are part of an organisation known as People and Pavements, and they've come up with a passenger direction scheme to free up crowded pavements and prevent frayed tempers. Billboard-wearing guides steer some people into the walking lanes and others into either window shopping or pram-pushing lanes. The group first met over the internet, and together they combined their various ideas on pedestrian calming, which they felt would be a big bonus for the community. So far, the scheme seems too confusing to be calming, but with some time before Christmas to iron out the kinks and an army of volunteers to don the signboards, pavement peace might just be possible.